Conrad felt the Dhampir's almost animalistic growl in his spine, a predatory grin spreading across his face as the vral light cruiser fired, its harsh red light missing the hull by mere feet off the starboard side. Batz actually laughed. Dev's normally small and polite Brazilian accent spun into some of the harshest curses Conrad had ever heard. The visor rested comfortably on his head, Batz feeding him exterior views over a heads-up display. The external feeds of the cameras gave him nearly 360 degrees of vision. The piloting stick in his hand responded like a fighter on steroids. "We're on it. Give me more power, Crispy," he roared as he shot past a Terran destroyer's bow that was engaging a pair of vral corvettes. Beyond the subject of Conrad's attention, a vral battleship seemed to shudder, a flash of light causing his vision to dim as a Mach accelerator round hit it squarely amidships. A dim red haze etched around his vision, letting him know that someone out there had weapons lock on them. The small numerical icon indicated that only one ship had the lock, the light cruiser itself. "Red line." Crispy's voice came through the small transmitter on the bridge, and Conrad laughed. Did he actually need more power? No. Did the HUD he was pointedly ignoring show him that the reactor was at full power? Oh yes. In fact, he could feel the power of this ship reverberating through his bones. A V marker superimposed on the HUD showed him he was in a full dive towards the light cruiser, which had noticed the Dhampir a little too late. The Dhampir shook as the corvette took a stray shot, but no one paid the sudden jolt any mind. Batz finally locked onto the light cruiser now that they had its attention, then promptly began sending a wave of electronic countermeasures to baffle their tracking. Distance readouts continued to count down, and Conrad's heart hammered in his chest. Chaos reigned, and all around them the rest of the fleet was engaged. Cruisers were set up in a line formation, the carrier Stormbird anchoring the fleet flanked by 2 battleships. The destroyers were driving the line forward, but the Dhampir, the other corvettes, they had no formation. Conrad couldn't believe, as the distance to the vral light cruiser counted down, that he had ever wanted to do anything but this. If he had gotten command of a destroyer, he would have been standing tall in his command station, calling out orders and commands, coordinating fire. Any kills made by his ship would have been seen at a distance, impartial, stately, ordered, dignified, not on the Dhampir. The vral were trying to fire at them, but their turret transit speed was almost comically slow at this range. The light cruiser began trying to turn like a wild animal avoiding a predator. "Broadcast the target, it's ours. No fucking touchy," Cass yelled. The light cruiser was less than 10 kilometers away, and he was still closing. This wasn't the engagement range for his ship. The rail guns of the corvette could reliably be accurate well over 200 kilometers against a ship the size of the vral light cruiser. This wasn't even knife-fighting range. As the numbers continued to count down to 9 kilometers and the vral vessel loomed larger, Conrad's lips parted into a snarl. No. There was going to be no stately, ordered, and dignified end for this vral ship. Conrad and his crew were going to murder it, violently. "Cass, you see those turrets turning to us?" Conrad yelled as he yanked the stick right, the Dhampir tilting wildly before he pulled the stick towards him hard. Another shot from the light cruiser sailing wide as the corvette went into a hard turn that overtaxed the artificial gravity and pushed him down in his seat. "Don't want to see it anymore, but it's playing with us." Cass wailed in protest even as he saw target markers appear over sections of the light cruiser, with over 6 green markers swung onto his vision over the light cruiser, becoming one right at the center line. Bordering the red haze, a light yellow haze began to flash but disappeared, and Conrad breathed out a thanks to whoever had distracted whatever ship that had been trying to acquire them. "Weapons free, Rev Dev," she called out, and although the human eye couldn't see the rounds of the railguns, the shield blooms from their impacts washed out. Rev and Dev, the weapons operators, had already turned the primary armament of the Dhampir on the light cruiser. 24 top-mounted railguns grouped in 4s all fired at once, and Conrad saw the bloom of the vral shields screaming in protest as all 24 rounds hit squarely at the same moment, even as he was jostled in his seat by the recoil. 5 seconds later, another salvo of the 130 mm rounds slammed into the light cruiser's shields at a little over 20 kilometers a second, hammering over 42 gigajoules of raw kinetic power per round against the vral's shields. The light cruiser tried to roll to bring its turrets to bear a little faster, but there was no escape. The third salvo did it, and for a brief instant Conrad could see a faint bubble around the light cruiser flash. Another, larger flash came from the light cruiser itself as the railgun rounds cut through the armor and bit deep. Primary and secondary detonations rippled from the impact. "That's their shields," Batz yelled out, even as Conrad yanked hard on the stick, turning the Dhampir 180 degrees, rapidly decelerating the corvette to match the speed of the injured cruiser. A trail of debris and gas blossomed out from the wounded vessel. Conrad watched as green markers, signifying the individual railgun mounts, locked onto the targets that Cass had pushed through. Another yellow haze began to flash inside the red, then promptly vanished. The numerical readout for weapons lock switched. He grimaced, knowing that somewhere in this chaotic mess, another vral ship had just locked on and was making a run on them. He felt the jolts in his seat even as the Dhampir started to defang its prey, rounds punching through the turrets, silencing the vral light cruiser even as it continued to turn away. "We've got a corvette mad at us, it's locking on. 50 kilometers and closing hard, 240 minus 46. Conrad relaxed a little, but just a little. As long as it was just a vral corvette, he didn't have to worry nearly as much. Compared to his Dhampir, a vral corvette was nothing. "Rev, take it down," Cass called out, focused on the light cruiser, continuing to mark targets as the two operators stripped the light cruiser of the ability to defend itself. Conrad turned his head, using the coordinates Batz had called out to him. He'd already marked the contact. As he turned his head, he could see flashes of vral weapons fire, and sometimes he saw a return from one of the Terran front vessels, 240 bearing minus 46 elevation. At this range, the corvette diving towards them was just a speck, even though it was over 90 meters long itself. Even as he looked, 3 green reticules moved over the yellow marker. Conrad used his free hand to quickly zoom in on the visor, even as he felt the bucking of the railguns. The vral corvette fired, the laser striking instantly, and Conrad felt his seat jolt as the shields of the Dhampir dropped by 10%. "Cruiser's toothless," Dev called out, his focus still locked on the light cruiser even as the Dhampir fired again. "They're fucking stupid," Conrad growled, watching as this time he could have sworn he could actually see the rounds heading towards the vral corvette that Rev had launched before the Dhampir had been hit. He waited for the corvette to turn, like he would have, or take a different transversal approach. It shocked him how arrogant the vral still were. 2 seconds later, he saw a bright flash as the railgun round slammed into the corvette's forward shields and collapsed them. The vral corvette seemed to shudder, then suddenly his visor's dimmers came on as the entire corvette erupted into a bright flash. The numerical readout display showing how many ships were currently targeting the Dhampir dropped back to 1. Conrad knew a reactor breach well by now. Nice. Target destroyed. "Target's fucked," Rev called back. When the dimmer relented, Conrad could see that the corvette had entire sections of its hull missing and was completely blasted off its dead-long charge of the Dhampir. Debris was flying from the explosion, forming a cloud that was quickly becoming invisible. The vral corvette that had recklessly charged to the aid of the stricken light cruiser began a slow, eternal, and stately path into the inner system, where it would either orbit the system until the star went nova, crash into one of the 6 planets in the system, or dive into the star itself. In either case, it didn't matter anymore. Most likely, a salvager would run it down. Conrad turned his gaze back onto the light cruiser just as the dimmers came back on. The shields of the Dhampir were lit up facing the light cruiser, and while at first Conrad felt his pulse spike from the thought they had somehow missed a weapons system, no alarms sounded. After a few seconds, he realized what they were actually firing and snorted. "Are they shooting us with point defense?" he asked incredulously. He heard Batz laughing. The Dhampir bucked again, then again as Rev lined his turrets back on the hapless vral vessel. "Someone turn that shit off!" Almost as if his crew could have done it for him, the light show stopped. Point defense could kill a fighter, but it wouldn't even scratch the Dhampir's paint. He saw the engine exhaust glow on the light cruiser sputter, then die out. "Cease fire, Cass, put it down," He looked in the top right of his display, checking the shields of his ship and seeing they had barely begun to be dragged down in efficiency from the burst of small lasers the vral used for anti-fighter cover. Crispy would already be compensating. The target icons from CAS shifted on the hull of the light cruiser, multiplying. It was strange just how quiet everything became, even though the music was still blaring. Conrad felt like a hunter crouching over a kill, the light cruiser derelict and drifting, its power out, its weapons destroyed. If they had noticed the Dhampir coming for them earlier, if they had begun to fight them earlier, the vral might have been able to make a fight out of it. They could have engaged on equal terms, but at less than 15,000 yards, they were all but helpless against the Dhampir. The target icons lingered over the light cruiser. CAS had targeted engine relays, life support systems, power junctions. He growled in satisfaction, looking at his kill through the eyes of his ship. He heard Rev call out for sequential fire, and the Dhampir began to shake. Individual rounds thundered out, the vral vessel being needled with pinpoint strikes instead of the bludgeoning sledgehammer strikes that had crippled it. Debris flew out from small stab wounds. Some of them flashed, and sometimes a secondary explosion sent jets of flame out of the entry wounds. One by one, each yellow icon from CAS was met by a green marker from Rev or Dev and was eliminated as the duo moved on. He pulled his visor off, looking over at CAS's station. She noticed the movement, and her bright red hair whipped around her head as she spun in her chair. She flashed him a predatory grin. He winked at her, then glanced around at the rest of his bridge crew, CAS following his gaze. Rev and Dev were still tapping on their panels, the light cruiser spitting debris each time the Dhampir rumbled. Batz was engrossed in his sensor readouts while Fidget was, fidgeting, all the while mouthing the words to the song blaring over the ship's speakers, even as he pressed both hands over the earpieces of his headset. "The bitch is dead, marking for salvage," Rev called out, and Conrad pulled his visor over his vision even as CAS spun back in her chair. "Batz, find us something to kill," Conrad yelled out, feeling his entire body surging as he kicked the throttle into high gear, gunning the corvette away from the derelict light cruiser. "Fidget, what's the fleet saying?" There was a bright flash against a small segment of the shields, something that Conrad dismissed almost instantly. If they had been locked onto, they would know. It was probably a piece of wreckage from the corvette they had killed finally reaching them. "Got one, 110-20, Batz called out, and Conrad felt the artificial gravity dig into him as he powered the Dhampir around. "Corvette squadron is making a run against the Melbourne." Everyone on the bridge pressed back into their chair as Conrad threw the Dhampir into full throttle. As the ship compensated for the thrust, the shields were peppered once again with drifting remains of another vessel ejected into the void. "Chill. The vral fleet, they are coming apart," Batz said, even as he solidified his sensor lock on the 4 corvettes that were now trying to harass the Terran front heavy cruiser Melbourne. Conrad turned his head, looking around the battlefield with the ship's eyes. Even to the untrained eye, there was a definite order to battle, even in one as chaotic and messy as this one. The vral ships that comprised its main line indeed looked as if they were moments from breaking formation. There was too much drift, too little cohesion. While the cruisers and battleships of the Terran line kept their spacing to provide each other with protective and overlapping fields of fire, the vral line was being filled with holes it didn't seem like it was mending. "Fidget, is anyone talking about their fleet?" Conrad said, even as he began angling for the first corvette. One of the corvettes harassing the Melbourne was flying at an oblique angle, turning towards the Terran front cruiser's stern when it suddenly took a hit and began tumbling in a straight line, spinning end over end. Conrad didn't need to zoom in to know that one wasn't a threat anymore, as large pieces of the hull flew off in different directions. Rev and Dev didn't need permission and didn't ask for it as they saw the angle of his approach and locked onto the corvette with all 24 railguns. Vral ships, compared to the old United Earth ships, were powerful, resilient, and bore technology that gave them a distinct tactical advantage. Over the course of the nearly 90 years of the First through the Sixth Orion Wars, or Vral Wars as Conrad knew them, that gap had been plugged, their technology analyzed, their weaknesses identified. As the Terran front had poured its entire being into warfare, the Vral Empire had not changed. Now, compared to the Terran front, the Vral ships were seen as what they were. Relics, newly forged antiques, built by an empire that had not been forced to change its approach and quite possibly didn't know how to anymore. The Dhampir shuddered, and the railguns designed specifically to counter vral shield weaknesses to kinetic impact, launched over 3 times the ordnance needed to collapse the vral corvette's shields. Seconds later, the shields of the vral corvette ceased to exist, and the hull seemed to blossom outwards. Rev and Dev were already aligning their railguns to the third target as the second's eviscerated hull flashed, splitting in half. It wasn't the flash of a reactor breach. Conrad could only assume a railgun round had struck a weapons magazine. The Dhampir shuddered again, and another lethal combination of shells flew out, and seconds later the third vral corvette began to lazily spin, its drive plume sputtering out as it careened in a straight line out into the void between stars. Conrad turned his head towards the fourth. "Holy shit! Batz, the Paris!" Fidget yelled, his voice a mixture of shock and concern. "What is it, Fidget?" he heard Cass call out, even as the Dhampir shuddered one more time, and both Rev and Dev cursed as one as the vral corvette spun in the vacuum, causing both their shots to go wide. "Chill 45 minus 110, Batz called out, and Conrad wanted to pull off his visor. If Fidget sounded concerned, Batz sounded more fatalistic. Conrad turned his head, and his eyes widened. Rev and Dev both loudly protested as their shots went wide again, the compensators for the railguns not enough to handle the sudden and violent turn of the Dhampir. "Crispy, we need everything, and don't give me that shit about Redline right now," Conrad yelled as the Dhampir rocketed towards the 8-kilometer-long Terran front battleship in the distance. No one needed to talk. No one needed clarification. It wasn't the Paris itself. It was the 3 vral heavy cruisers bearing down on it, and the battleship that was burning towards it. Even as they watched, a vral corvette slammed into the Paris's shields near the bow of the massive battleship, debris erupting everywhere as the vral hull collapsed against the energy matrix. The light show coming from the Paris came from hundreds of railguns, 2 Mac cannons, and a host of large lens lasers. "Oh shit," he heard Rev say, even as a sudden surge hit the ship, evidence Crispy had pushed the ship's reactor past its safety point. "Oh shit!" Rev yelled in alarm, realizing what he was seeing, and 3 of the green reticles that signified his controlled railguns centered on the drive plume of the vral battleship, even as another form shot past it. Another vral corvette slamming a few seconds later at full speed into the shields of the Paris. "Cass, target the drive, now!" Conrad yelled as he wanted to do something, anything. He could only watch as yellow target indicators flashed onto the distant vral battleship as it plunged down towards the Paris, on what was clear to anyone as a clear intent to ram it. Conrad knew Terran ships were tough, but he knew they weren't that tough. Rev and Dev began firing salvos as fast as the autoloader would allow. They weren't the only crew that had spotted the danger. The Paris was twisting in space, its fire still focused on the heavy cruisers bearing down on it for much the same reason as the battleship itself. The behemoth was a graceful thing, sleek and proud, and as it began to adjust its course, Conrad saw dozens of Terran ships disengaging to re-engage the vral ships trying to ram her. The vral battleship's shields, battered from the damage it had been taking throughout the course of the fight, were already out. The hull was being torn open from the attentions of the other 2 Terran battleships that were actively throwing everything they could at the vral vessel. Streams of thrusters from missile pods terminated against the increasingly ruined hull of the vral warship, even as the Paris's own guns turned towards it, the missiles detonating within and blasting sections of the hull as large as the Dhampir away. The Paris's weapon systems opened up at point-blank range, an absolute cascade of blistering railgun rounds and laser batteries. The Paris's top-mounted missile pods seemed to all erupt at once, sending their entire payloads the scant kilometer directly into the port forecastle of the vral battleship. And for a brief moment, Conrad wondered if the missiles had been too close to arm. The entire front quarter of the vral ship, a prow at least half a kilometer wide, erupted outwards in a silent death scream that painted the Paris's shields with its death. The nearly 9-kilometer-long vral battleship seemed to buckle in on itself, the very hull appearing to ripple. It seemed to come to a dead stop in space as secondary explosions ripped through its core, before a final flash from the impact of a Mach accelerator round tore through its midships. The drive plume guttered out. The monstrous symbol of vral might transformed into a twisted mass of metal. Conrad's joy was short-lived. The Paris's helmsman maneuvered to avoid the dead battleship bearing down on her, and had only managed to give one of the heavy cruisers a clean shot. The Paris turned its gun ports back to the heavy cruisers, the first a floating wreck propelled only by inertia. The second was ignored as it was currently beginning to drift off course, having garnered the attention of the strike craft. Its drive section was a ruin, a cloud of fighters taking shots while dancing around larger corvettes and even larger destroyers that were pounding away at it with every sort of munition they could muster. Even as Conrad saw the third, he knew it was too late. The vral were too close, going too fast, and even with the combined fist of the Paris's armament, she wouldn't be stopped. The Paris's shields were tortured under the spray of debris from the dead battleship above her, giving the massive battleship what almost appeared to be a halo. The heavy cruiser, 5 kilometers of alloy, drove into the shields of the Paris and the halo vanished. For a moment, Conrad hoped the impact had slowed the vral ship, but a split second later he watched the entire battleship jar to the side as the heavy cruiser slammed into its starboard side fore. Laser batteries opened up from the cruiser as it continued to drive against the Paris, scars pitting into the hull seconds before plumes from missile pods streaked the short distances from the pods to the Paris itself. Conrad watched in fascinated horror as the point defenses of the Paris lit up the area between them, entire sections of the heavy cruiser simply ceasing to exist under a torrent of fire from the Paris herself. A fraction of a second later, the running lights of the Paris went dark along its entire starboard side, secondary explosions rippling along the hull. For a horrifying moment, Conrad thought the Paris itself was going to fall apart, fracturing just like the vral battleship that was now harmlessly floating past it had. The hull stayed together. The music on the bridge was suddenly cut off, and Conrad kept holding his breath. A moment later, Conrad's horror returned as he watched a vral destroyer eclipse over the dead battleship, only to angle down towards the Paris. His mouth fell open as he watched it fly at near full speed into the hull of the beautiful warship, and the sudden silent explosion that sent shrapnel out in all directions was more than enough to snap him out of his stupor. Batz, lock anything inside of 20 kilometers of the Paris. Rev, Dev, corvettes, and destroyers. Cass, we're looking for things we can kill. If it's heavier than a cruiser, leave it to the cruisers, Conrad yelled as he turned his head, looking with the ship's eyes as they looked past the Paris. Fuck's sake, he whispered, then promptly turned to the first target that showed itself. For the next 10 minutes, kill marks didn't matter. Targets of pride didn't matter. The Dhampir orbited the Paris like a bee guarding a bear, the Paris itself drifting slowly, its weapons tracking nothing. Conrad didn't know if he was guarding a corpse, but he wouldn't allow the vral to defile her further. Apparently, more than the Dhampir's crew itself felt the same. A swarm of fighters angled after every vral ship that still bore a drive signature. A flight of corvettes took up the orbit of the Paris itself, and a full destroyer squadron positioned themselves along the drive section of the Paris, which had gone, according to Batz, completely silent. As the heavy cruiser Talladega pulled up alongside the Paris, Conrad noticed that the vral heavy cruiser was actually embedded by its prow in the very hull of the Paris itself. The vral were pushed back, but the Dhampir remained, slowing its orbit and eventually falling into a stationary roll beside it, drifting through space. Conrad said nothing, even as the few remaining vral ships were being chased out of the system. Later he would learn that none had made it out. He slowly turned the Dhampir to face the Paris, and he reached up, taking off the visor. He looked around the bridge, seeing Fidget leaned over his console. Cass was looking out of the small viewport in front, her hand over her mouth. Rev and Dev were both leaning back in their chairs. Rev's hand was rubbing his forehead. As Conrad pulled himself out of his chair, he heard Batz cursing under his breath. He looked through the view screen at the Paris and blew out a breath, moving towards the viewport, only to feel Cass's hand slide around his arm as he passed her, pulling him towards her. Both of them stared at the drifting debris, the running lights on the port side dimming every so often. "They still have power, so that's good at least," Cass whispered to him, and he nodded, hopeful. A few moments later, Dev pointed towards the port side, near midships. "Looks like they are docking fighters." Conrad leaned forward and then half-turned to go back to his chair to put his visor back on, but Cass's hand tightened on his arm. He felt too drained to argue. Dev pointed again. "That's exactly what they are doing. The strikes are docking." "Looks like they have a few shuttles coming in too," Rev added, and Conrad looked to Fidget. "Are they still quiet over there?" Fidget looked to Conrad and nodded once. "No mainline broadcasts, but apparently someone on the Paris is talking. Not sure what they are using, but we're not picking it up." "Put it up on the bridge speakers," Conrad ordered, and a few seconds later voices started coming through the small transmitters sequestered throughout the bridge. Conrad listened to the back and forth and leaned against Cass's chair and Cass herself. "Teams are there already. We've got a good amount of corvettes and the 2nd and 4th destroyer squadrons out there poking the bodies. Melbourne, this is 4th TAC Wing. Permission to dock with mothership." "Granted, 4th TAC Wing." "Sri Lanka actual requesting line to Melbourne actual. Standby Sri Lanka, code 223. Sri Lanka actual confirms code 223. Conrad listened to the fleet-wide channel, staring at the drifting Paris, and he didn't look away. More than anything, he wanted to hear Calhoun's voice come over the channel, but he knew that even if Calhoun was alive, it would most likely not be him that spoke. For the first time, he truly realized what that ship and its captain had meant to him. It was something he couldn't put into words, but seeing the Paris drifting, damaged, scarred by vral weapon fire, it was a feeling like his own hometown had been attacked. The way the hull had jarred when the heavy cruiser had slammed into it, to the unknowing, may not have looked even dangerous. Anyone who actually knew what they were seeing would know well that the Paris had been suddenly and violently moved almost 100 meters by a force of mass that was at the very least half of the weight of the Paris itself. Anyone not strapped into a chair would have been thrown, no, hurled, if not for the artificial gravity of the Paris itself. Even then, with as strong as those systems were, Conrad knew very well they had never been tested like that before. A few weeks prior, the Dhampir had been hit hard by an errant missile from a dying vral ship, and the impact had thrown Conrad back into his seat so forcefully that when the impact rebounded, he was folded double in his chair and almost thought he had broken his neck. "Fleet, this is Melbourne. Begin post-combat breakdown and report status. Sri Lanka, Trafalgar. I have a sit-rep on the Simmons 211. Sri Lanka copies 211. Melbourne, Paris." Conrad felt his breath hitch. "Paris, go ahead. Melbourne, Paris. Paris Actual wants to speak to the Fleet Admiral at your earliest convenience." Conrad let go of the breath he was holding and relaxed, and he felt Cass's hand leave his back. He listened to the chatter a few more seconds, then turned back to his chair. Calhoun was alive. At least there was that. The old man was alive. He slid back into his chair and pulled one of his side panels closer. "All right, get that off," he said, looking to Batz. "Find out who I'm sending this report to." As he began to bring up the Dhampir's vitals, he glanced over at Cass again. She met his gaze and mouthed, "You okay?" He just nodded once, tapping his chest and pointing at the Paris, then gave her a thumbs up. She might not have understood what he meant, but she nodded and got to her work. Conrad took a look at the report that was displaying on his screen and blew out a breath as updates from his crew started coming in. The fight had lasted almost an hour, and in that time, Rev and Dev had run through nearly half of their railgun ammunition. When he had taxed the reactor, apparently, he had ruined a fair amount of coolant too. "Batz, who am I bitching to?" he called out. "The Falmouth, chill," Batz called out. 554. He reached up, pulled his headset from its placeholder, and pressed 554 on his keypad next to his headset. He waited for a few seconds, then hit his transmit button. "Falmouth, Dhampir actual," he said once. Then he looked down at his sit-rep, waiting for the reply. "Dhampir, go ahead," came the reply. "All systems online, no damage to report. Request ammo resupply. Sending full sit-rep." Conrad finalized the report, then sent it through to the Falmouth. He sat back into his chair and began drumming his fingers on his armrest. "Understood, Dhampir. Take station at 20 kilos at 180 from Melbourne, and stand down until 23:30 hours, came the reply. And Conrad looked at the clock. It was only 1400, 9.5 hours between then and now. Wilco Falmouth, Dhampir actual out, he said, putting his headset back in place. Instead of manually guiding the Dhampir, he used a panel to plot his course, setting the autopilot and station keeping, and making sure he set up object avoidance. He double-checked his settings, then removed the visor, setting it in its holder and pushing himself out of his chair, reaching up and pressing a stud so he could talk to his entire crew. All right, stand down until 23:30, Crispy and Fidget. You're on station until 1800. Batz and Doc, you've got 1800 onwards. Around him, his bridge crew started taking off their straps and stretching, except for Rev and Dev, who began beelining away, and he pulled himself out of their path. Cass smirked as they passed, securing her station. Conrad began securing his own, locking his displays in place. After a moment, he straightened and looked out of the viewport as the autopilot made a slow and graceful turn away from the Paris. Seeing the Paris slip away, he was glad he wasn't still on it, and that he was on the Dhampir now. There was nothing he could do about it in any case. As he left the bridge, he made the sharp turn to the right and half-lunged, half-crawled up the cramped ladder well, opening the secured door. It was only then that he saw Cass behind him, and he left the door open for her. She shut it behind her as he continued to his quarters, and he slid open his door and moved sideways inside. The closing of his door was interrupted by Cass's hand. She drew herself around the corner, stepping in the doorway. "You okay?" she asked in a low tone, and he nodded once before he stepped away. He sat down on his bed, then drew down the desk from the wall and brought up the panel. "Don't look okay," she continued, stepping into his quarters and shutting the door. He started to bring the panel to life, but instead of bringing it up all the way, he just tapped on the side of the panel for a few moments. "Just rough to see the Paris in that kind of shape," he said, closing the panel back down and pushing the desk back into its place on the wall. "I spent a few years on that ship. I don't know, it's hard to explain." He glanced at her as she reached up and ran her fingers through her hair, leaning against his wall locker. "Well, I get it. For me, it's the tiger lily," Cass said, reaching up and unzipping her uniform top. She pulled it and the t-shirt underneath to the side, showing a small symbol on her shoulder blade. She leaned in, and he leaned forward, looking at the small, quarter-sized tattoo. The fine lines showed a ship's prow and a service number, and he grinned as he leaned back. She leaned back against the locker. "Spent 4 years there. Forward Rail Carriage 4 was my home." He laughed and leaned back against the wall. "Command and control. I think I saw 2 decks of the Paris the entire time I was there." She shrugged as if to say she knew the feeling. Suddenly there was a silence that descended between the two, and they just stared at each other. The scent of her in the tightness of his room was a different experience, and it took him a minute to realize that the silence had stretched into uncomfortable territory. Well, uncomfortable for him at least. A slow smile crept its way onto her face when finally something popped into his head to say. "Well, I don't have a tattoo of it or anything." "Well, this isn't the only one I have," she said, and she pushed herself up, reaching for the zipper of her suit, and for a second he thought she was going to draw it down the rest of the way. He was suddenly and starkly aware of how tight her t-shirt was clinging to her, the way her hair was drifting down one side of her neck, the swell of her chest and the curve of her hips. She stepped closer to him, and he raised an eyebrow. He became starkly aware of the fact he was staring at her chest and raised his eyes to hers. His eyes narrowed at the expression on her face, the broad teasing smile, the glint in her eyes. "Maybe I'll show you someday." Her hand snapped up, zipping the suit back to her neck. He closed his eyes and breathed in slowly. She laughed. "Let me know if you need anything, Chill." He stared at her for a few seconds and honestly felt cheated. He turned back to his desk and began pulling it down again. "You too, Cass," he almost growled out, glancing at her as she opened his cabin door and slid back into the passageway. She stopped at the doorway and looked back at him over her shoulder, sliding her hand on her hip. She stayed there, staring at him, his expression flat until finally he burst out, "Well, close the damn door. She laughed and slammed it shut.